Chapter 7, Expansion and Division. Part 6, The Growing Conflict over Slavery. The Abolitionist Movement. In the meantime, American culture was splitting even more deeply over this persistent question about Americans holding slaves. There was no way that the problem was going to simply go away on its own or just be avoided, as many Americans had earlier held the hope that this might be possible. But high-sounding principles easier to achieve than actual plans of action. Footnote. Jefferson, for instance, though admitting the wrong of slavery, could not bring himself to free his slaves. Instead, in his will, he required the sale of his slaves to other slaveholders to pay for the debts he'd run up by constantly redesigning his Monticello home in his effort to perfect it as a miniature utopia. Unfortunately, such a large part of American culture, especially in the South and in parts of the West, was built on ideals requiring the labor services, voluntary or involuntary, of other people. To undo such a social system was to destroy the cultural ideals of economic and social success themselves. Christian abolitionists. But there was also no way that the spirit of Puritan Protestantism, widespread in the North, could ever come to tolerate intellectually and emotionally this behavior in the land of freedom. Slavery violated every Christian sensibility of the Northerners, to a point that some in the North grew increasingly impatient at the willingness of even their own Northern politicians to tolerate or ignore this stain, this sin corrupting the soul of the great American nation. Americans were understood to be a covenant people, called to display to the world the glories of living as Christ's people, to be a light spreading hope into the darkness of the surrounding world. Surely slavery made a mockery of this covenant. Some felt very strongly that God would even curse the nation for breaking this covenant that their forefathers had agreed to 2 centuries earlier. And the republic that had been put in place only a few generations back, a republic dedicated to the high calling of being a light to the nations, would fail miserably. Thus, the institution of slavery had to be abolished immediately. And so it was that those who advocated such action came to be called abolitionists. Abolitionism and the Second Great Awakening. In fact, many abolitionists saw in slavery the seeds of certain destruction of the American people and society, by the hand of God no less. Indeed, the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening, which continued to burn forward through the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, had made slavery its main hot-button issue. Preachers, newspapermen, self-appointed social reformers, and even a small handful of congressmen saw this issue ultimately tied up with how God was looking in judgment at his covenant people. America could not afford to lose its soul over this issue. In general, however, abolitionists were not widely popular, not even in the North at first. They were viewed as being dangerously disruptive of the good order of the Republic. Those who viewed themselves as being of a wiser nature tended to presume that the good moral sense of Americans would eventually work this problem out. Thus it was in 1836 that Congress had placed its gag rule on any further discussions of the slavery issue. Europe's example. Then also there was the fact that the English had already set the noble example in 1807 by abolishing slavery within England, and then in 1833 by extending abolition to the entire British Empire. France had outlawed slavery as far back as 1794 during the French Republican Revolution, though Napoleon had reduced the practice somewhat after 1804. And then in 1848, France made the move to abolish slavery throughout all of its colonies. Thus also to the American humanists, Americans' failure to follow the moral example of England and France brought unbearable shame to America as the supposed model of enlightened republicanism. Most American supporters of freedom for the slaves advocated a gradual process of emancipation. They considered this to be the more responsible solution to the problem. Others supported the idea of sending blacks, both free and slave, back to Africa, where it was supposed that there would be a more natural fit for them, and thus Liberia, among others, had been established in 1820 by President Monroe, and thus Liberia's capital, Monrovia, as a resettlement colony on the west coast of Africa. William Lloyd Garrison. However, the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society and publisher of the newspaper The Liberator, wanted abolition to occur immediately and fully. He even went so far as to accuse the U.S. Constitution of being a pact with slavery. This put him among the most radical of the abolitionists. The newspapers. A number of other newspapermen, such as Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, were also constant in their verbal assault on the vile practice of slavery. But this could be a very dangerous issue for a newspaperman to pursue. In 1837, an angry pro-slavery mob attacked the newspaper office of the Alton, Illinois Observer, run by the abolitionist and Presbyterian preacher Elijah Parrish Lovejoy, the fourth such attack on him and his press. But this time they murdered him, making him a martyr to the abolitionist cause and pushing his brother Owen into the leadership of the Illinois abolitionists. Female voices. The abolitionist cause was also moving front and center in the midst of a growing feminist movement in America. Alongside the temperance movement to slow down or prohibit entirely the consumption of alcohol, Amelia Bloomer and Harriet Beecher Stowe, for instance, the public school movement to extend public schooling into the poorer neighborhoods of America's fast-growing cities, and the movement to reform prisons and insane asylums, that would be Dorothea Dix, the call for the abolition of slavery stirred women to tremendous public action, making even some male social reformers nervous. The Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah, were Southerners who moved to the North to get away from the horror of slavery, and from their new home in the North dedicated themselves to opposing the practice by any means possible, particularly through the distribution of pamphlets and lecturing around the country. As a Quaker, Lucretia Mott put her views to work in lectures enjoining women to see it was their duty to push for the immediate end of slavery. Also joining the movement would be future suffragists, that is, ones demanding the right of all women to vote, Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone. Black voices. Free blacks also joined the abolitionist chorus, speaking from the horror of personal experience. Thus, Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman worked actively in support of immediate freedom for the slaves, Tubman becoming active in aiding escaped slaves to head north through the Underground Railroad, and Sojourner Truth joining the speaking circuit to publicize the need for immediate action on the issue. But undoubtedly, the most important voice coming from the black community itself was that of Frederick Douglass, whose obvious intelligence put to lie the idea of inherent black inferiority on which the South built their moral case. Douglass was one of the greatest orators and writers on the subject. His books, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave in 1845, and My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, both becoming best-selling works. John Quincy Adams, and working from within the political system was the ever-vigilant John Quincy Adams. He took the bold course of presenting himself for election to the House of Representatives in 1830, after having lost to Andrew Jackson his bid for re-election as president in 1828. Now a Massachusetts representative in the House, he proved to be far more politically effective than he had been as president. and on the basis of his strong opposition to slavery, he built an ever-growing reputation, both in focused support and in focused opposition. He simply ignored the 1836 gag rule and pushed the issue ever before Congress, frequently by stirring his pro-slavery opponents to wrath and thus actionable rebuttal. He made dedicated enemies, of course, but he also began to have his impact in Congress as he rose higher as a clear moral voice that constantly forced Congress to face the issue of this vile institution. He even became close friends with his former arch-rival within his Whig party, Henry Clay. The slave owners' moral response. Southerners, such as the fiery-tongued Calhoun of South Carolina, were quick to react to the moral condensation coming from the self-righteous abolitionists and soon formulated a moral reply of their own. As the slaveholders themselves now put things, slavery existed as a divine ordinance of God himself because colored people were unable to function outside of the system of mastery by the white man. Thus, slavery was more than merely a legal matter. It was a racial and even religious matter as well. Whites and coloreds were two different breeds of people, obviously, to any reasonable observer, unequal in their natural character. Coloreds were clearly destined by God himself to serve, as the sons of Ham, the superior white race. Footnote. Because Ham saw the nakedness of his father Noah, that is Genesis chapter 10, this biblical pronouncement fell upon him and his descendants. Cursed be Canaan, son of Ham, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. Hamitic was a term applied to one of many African groups, and Southerners concluded that it was through this biblical reference to Ham and his descendants that the curse of servanthood fell eternally upon the Hamitics, in other words, those of African descent. Clever, but horribly flawed logic, not to mention terrible biblical exegesis, that is, analysis, but it seemed to most Southerners to suffice as a very compelling argument. So, to the Southerners, messing with God's ordinance, as certainly the abolitionists were doing, was itself going to bring on America the wrath of God. The moral chasm deepens. So there it was, two opposing viewpoints, both enshrined with a keen sense of divine legitimacy, both employing precise human logic to develop and deepen their two contradicting moral positions. There was no way that the issue, therefore, was going to simply go away on its own. The challenge of answering the moral question of slavery had spun America into two moral camps, with only a small and rapidly declining moral ground separating them. Conflict, bloody conflict, was increasingly the only way this critical issue was going to be resolved. The moral impact of the Mexican-American War. Many of the Whigs of the American North had viewed the Mexican-American War as little more than the effort of the South to strengthen its political position in Congress by adding newly conquered territories and thus subsequently future states to the pro-slavery roster. Most notable in their opposition to the Mexican-American War in this regard had been Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. They employed every argument possible concerning the moral degeneracy of the imperialism America had inflicted on its Mexican neighbors, although generally most Whigs certainly encouraged the idea of American expansion westward, as long as any newly acquired territories remained in the free soil category. The Wilmot Proviso. Then in August of 1846, during the debate approving the $2 million in appropriations underwriting potential negotiations with Mexico, which it was hoped at the time might end the war, the gauntlet was thrown down in Congress by Representative David Wilmot. He wanted attached to the appropriations bill the proviso that would ban slavery in any of the lands that the Mexicans might turn over to the Americans, the so-called Mexican cession, as a result of a much hoped-for negotiated peace settlement. The bill passed in the House, but failed in the Senate when Congress dismissed without considering the resolution. When Polk later that year made another request for funds to negotiate a peace settlement with Mexico, the proviso was reintroduced and hotly debated. Except as debate continued, demand was added the following year that the prohibition of slavery be extended to any new territory acquired by the United States. Tempers were now hot. Then Alabama representatives proposed a counter-resolution which would leave the slavery issue to the individual territories to decide, building on the philosophy of the sovereignty of the states, or states' rights. The measure failed to pass, but united the Southern representatives into a strong regional bond, one that would build and become the main political identifier among members of Congress. America's major political division now followed not on the more traditional Whig Democratic Party lines, but ominously North-South regional lines. The parties themselves were splitting into North-South factions, especially as the Wilmot Proviso kept getting introduced time and again in the North's hope of finally forcing the end of slavery in the South. John Quincy Adams' death and the finalizing of the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty. When the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty was submitted to the Senate for ratification in February, the Whigs were bitterly opposed to any affirmation of the Mexican-American War and its outcome because of the blatant imperialism involved. Even with the revealing of the generous terms offered to and accepted by Mexico in the negotiations of 1848, a storm erupted. Certainly the generosity undercut some of the imperialist argument, though others were appalled at just that generosity, wondering why anyone would consider the outcome to be a win for America. But mostly the eruption occurred over the idea of a number of potentially new states in the Southwest being lined up for statehood, and how this would tip the balance in the growing North-South split over slavery. Leading the attack on the treaty was the distinguished Whig senator from Massachusetts, Daniel Webster, the great orator. Then, in the middle of discussions going on in the House, John Quincy Adams was felled by a heart attack, bringing the proceedings to a halt over the next days as the nation stood watch over the last man with personal connections with the Republic's founding fathers, and who himself had come to grow greatly in the esteem of his congressional colleagues because of his cool wit and sharp insights. When he died on the 23rd of February, the nation mourned. The effect was to sober the proceedings in the Senate, which in early March finally moved to approve the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, 38-14. The election of 1848. Zachary Taylor becomes U.S. President. Once again, Clay supposed that he had the Whig nomination all sewed up as he approached the nominating convention in Philadelphia. But the war had put Taylor front and center in the hearts of the American people, especially among a younger generation that had less reverence for the great compromiser, Clay. Similarly, the long-standing political star Daniel Webster suffered from the same loss of relevance to the younger generation. Webster finally threw his support behind Taylor, who in turn offered him the position as his vice presidential running mate, which Webster declined, though when Taylor died 16 months into his presidency, Webster would regret not having taken up the offer. So Taylor turned to the strongly anti-slavery New York Millard Fillmore as his running mate. Taylor's political views were largely unknown. He was a Kentuckian and slaveholder, a rather unusual social profile who for one confessed himself to be a Whig, though he seemed to have no strongly held views on the subject of slavery. He was a soldier first and foremost, a strong American nationalist, and a national hero. And that is what the American people found so appealing about him. Running against the Whigs was a new face in the competition, a new third party, the strongly abolitionist Free Soil Party, which ran Van Buren as its presidential candidate, actually drawing about 10% of the national vote. And, as usual, opposing the Whigs, but also now the Free Soilers as well, was the pro-states' rights Democrat Party with its strong Southern support, which ran Lewis Cass as its presidential candidate. In the election itself, in which the voter turnout was quite light, Taylor won a slight 5% majority of the popular vote, though he ultimately received 163 electoral votes to Cass's 137 votes in securing for himself the U.S. presidency. All in all, the election was a clear indication that the nation was ready for a break from the tensions of the Mexican-American War and the slavery issue. But sadly, the latter was not destined to be.